Can you imagine getting to sit on the front porch with one of the most beloved writers of the 20th century? I know I can't, but my next guest can. Wayne Flynt is a Southern historian and educator. He is the author of 14 books dealing with Southern politics, history, and culture. He's won numerous awards, including the Alabama Library Association Award for Nonfiction, the F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald Museum Award, and a nomination for the Pulitzer Prize. And his friendship with Harper Lee, spanning over 12 years, is now a book called Afternoons with Harper Lee. So in just a few minutes, we'll be joined by Wayne Flynt, and we're going to talk about his friendship with Harper Lee. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Tea with Tara. I'm joined by author Wayne Flynt, author of the new book, Afternoons with Harper Lee. Mr. Flynt, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
So I want to start out with how you and Harper Lee know each other, because I think it's everyone's dream who's ever read To Kill a Mockingbird to know Harper Lee. How did that meeting happen between you two?
Well, I had met her casually when she spoke at Eufaula, Alabama, which is where her little sister lived. And we were organizing a history and heritage conference. I had suggested perhaps we invite Truman Capote, knowing that Harper was notoriously unwilling to speak at events like that. But her sister was very cautious about that and said, well, let me talk to Nelle first. And the next thing we knew, it was Nelle who was coming to speak, not Truman. And obviously afterwards, as I came to know them both better, I fully understood that he probably would have arrived high on drugs and incapable and incoherent. And so essentially what Nelle did was to voluntarily take his place doing something she hated, which was speaking in public. And my son asked if she would sign his copy of To Kill a Mockingbird at the end of the event. She signed his copy. I offered her my copy to sign, and she said, I only sign for adults. And very quickly got up and left. And so it was not the most cooperative meeting that I've ever been involved with. And so for years, I had no contact with her at all. Then I received a telephone call from a dear friend who's an attorney in Birmingham. And he said that Nelle had had a stroke, had spent 3 weeks at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, and was going to be transferred to Lakeshore Rehab in Birmingham and would probably be there for months. And he said, very few people are being told this. And we thought perhaps you and your wife could visit her occasionally, which we did. And she immediately loved Darty, my wife, who had Parkinson's disease. And they bonded partly based on their illness. And Darty, my wife, began to take her chocolate concoctions of various kinds, which she loved, even though she was not supposed to have chocolate. And from that point on, we just became very close friends.
I'm sorry. You write in your book, Afternoons with Harper Lee, that her personal life was very important to her to keep private, and that you never pried into her personal life. And I was just wondering how it was to keep a friendship with Harper Lee without overstepping her boundaries that she set.
It really was almost seamless because we were not particularly interested in details of her life. And it was more a matter of serendipity than it was of curiosity. For instance, we realized after the first visit that for one thing, she was going to be there a very long time, months. And for another thing, she was really bored, as you can imagine. She's in a place where only a handful of people know she's located. She has a fake name, uh, and she's bored. She's doing uh, difficult physical rehab every day. She's tired. And so we brought her our recorder and a whole series of CDs of writers that we loved and had already bought. For instance, Jane Austen, and a professional reader reading Pride and Prejudice. We brought her screw tape letters with John Cleese, the famous British comedian, reading screw tape letters in a manner that can only be described as hysterically funny. We brought her Eudora Welty reading her short story, Why I Live at the PO. And it turned out that, of course, Jane Austen and C.S. Lewis and Eudora Welty were three of her all-time favorite writers. And so, to some degree, our friendship was bonded by a CD player and by CDs. Then, as she grew stronger, we took her out to lunch one day. She was allowed to leave with us. And over that 6 months, we were probably there 10, 12, 15 times, talking to her about literature in Alabama, New York City, whatever she wanted to talk about. So that's how it all began.
So I want you to take me back a little bit to the beginning of her writing career, because she left Monroeville, Alabama in 1949 for New York City. Did she go to New York with the intentions of being a writer? Was that why she went there in the first place?
Absolutely. The way she described it was, in fact, we gave her a chance to say something else. I said, well, your best friend, Truman Capote, had left Monroeville and gone to New York City. He'd already published Other Voices, Other Rooms, and other scintillating early novels. And so I said, did you go to New York City because he was there and he was your best friend from childhood? She said, Wayne, I went to New York City because I wanted to be a writer. And in the 1940s, if you wanted to be a writer, you went to New York City. That's where all the publishing houses were. And so she said New York was full of aspiring writers in the 1940s. And so she was very dismissive of the idea that Truman had anything at all to do with her going to New York City. But you must remember that that narrative was part of a narrative after he died, after their friendship. The way she phrased it, I said, did you push him away because of his promiscuity, his drug addiction, his alcoholism? And she very quickly interrupted me and said, I never pushed him away. He pushed me away.
Wow. Yeah, I heard there was trouble between the friendship, and yeah, that's a shame because they were really close when they were growing up. In fact, I think the character of Dill in To Kill a Mockingbird was based on Truman Capote. Now, when she began writing To Kill a Mockingbird in New York, you write in your book that between 1900 and the time Mockingbird was written, the county had lynched over a dozen Black men. I was wondering how this affected Harper Lee and how much of her town's history was incorporated into this To Kill a Mockingbird.
An enormous amount. It would be almost impossible to conceive of Mockingbird without Monroe County. Uh, the family had been there for a long time. They were deeply embedded through her father, who was a highly respected attorney, and there weren't many attorneys in the county, unlike larger counties in Alabama. Monroe was the county seat, so he was the most prominent lawyer in the most prominent town in a very important county that had been there since statehood. And all of those factors were, I think, factors in terms of her understanding of the stories she wanted to write. And of course, her father wanted her to be a lawyer. And she actually took one law class at the University of Alabama, which she said I thoroughly despised and did not want to be a lawyer. And I wanted to write.
Because her sister was a lawyer, correct?
Sister Alice was an attorney, correct. And she became the head of the firm when her father died and was absolutely encyclopedic in her knowledge of the history and culture of Monroe County in Southwest Alabama. In fact, she told us story after story after story after story about the early history of the county. And it was as if it was as if she had lived forever. And of course, she did live for 103 years, which
Wow.
was more than half the history of the state.
That's amazing. So the novel To Kill a Mockingbird delves a great deal into racial injustice. And I was just wondering if you know how Nell's or Harper Lee's hometown dealt with how did they receive the book?
Well, ambivalently. Uh, they're very proud of Harper Lee. They are very proud that the book is the most beloved book in the world. They have great pride in not only her, but a whole series of other writers, both black and white, very successful writers. One of them, Cynthia Tucker, the daughter of an African-American school teacher whose father was also not only a principal, but also caddied on the golf course for Nell's father. This kind of easy intersection of racial relations in a small southern town. And Cynthia Tucker went on to a distinguished career and a Pulitzer Prize in journalism for the Atlanta Constitution. The attitude of her father in race was, some would say, paternalistic, that he was not so much a believer in social equality as he was a believer in judicial justice. Or to put it another way, he was a man of his time, and his time was the early 20th century. But he was appalled by racial injustice. He was appalled by racial violence. He tried to cross the race line as much as crossing the race line was allowed, which was not very much in the time that he lived.
And was Mockingbird at all autobiographical of Harper Lee's life? Is she any of the characters? Did she identify with any of them?
She really did not. Pretty obviously, she is the little girl. She cast herself in a almost romantic part of her life. Kids playing together on the courthouse lawn, playing football, and her trying to protect the kids from what I believe to be the Red Hills north of Monroe, still in Monroe County, but a mystical land of strange creatures, the largest variety of oak trees in the world, part of the fall line of the Alabama River, but different from almost all other fault lines in its flora and fauna. And so there are these two worlds, the mystical world from which the Cunninghams came from, and then the urban, fairly sophisticated world of Monroeville itself.
So To Kill a Mockingbird really became basically an overnight sensation. I mean, it was a literary sensation. Was she caught off guard by the success? Because I read that she said she was hoping for a quick and merciful death at the hands of reviewers, but I don't really think, according to the research I've done, it doesn't sound like she was expecting it to become this national sensation, international sensation that it became.
You're absolutely correct. She had no idea that this very personal book, written about a place that would be as remote from the typical sophisticated American writing and reading audience of the 1950s and 60s, could possibly be. And so I think her description of the quick death is not hyperbole. I think it's exactly what she thought would happen. She's a 20, 30 something young writer. She's in New York City, this very urbane and sophisticated place where she felt uncomfortable and uneasy. She was an extremely private person. She was not a shy person. She was not a reclusive person. She was not an antisocial person, but she was an extremely private person. So she does not have a social network beyond the one that Truman Capote furnished her, which he had already established. Therefore, writing 12 hours a day was for her a pleasure, whereas for me, it would be like hell because I enjoy social relations. She didn't give a hoot about social relations. She just wanted to be a writer.
Was she aware of the rumors that circulated about how Truman Capote supposedly wrote Mockingbird?
I'm sure she was. It would have been hard not to have been aware of that. And Truman, in his various iterations, that is, as an alcoholic, as a social butterfly, as a drug addict, might very well have claimed anything. And he liked to exaggerate, and he liked to expose his self-importance to everyone. And it would not be surprising to me, and I don't think it would have been surprising to her, if he had somehow suggested, and it could have been as casual as, well, if it hadn't been for me, Nelle could have never written that book, or I suggested that Nelle write that book, or I gave Nelle some of my characters to write. I mean, there are all sorts of ways that you could reconstruct a possible conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because she actually helped him, right?
Correct.
With research and in cold blood.
If not for her, there would have been no cold blood, because people in Garden City, Kansas, thought he came from the moon. I mean, self-consciously homosexual, very small person who spoke with a squeaky little voice. I mean, people just did not warm to him, to put it in the most obvious way. And so when she put on her nicest Methodist church dress and wandered around Garden City asking people what they thought about the Clutters and what they thought about the town, they responded like warm-hearted Methodist people do in a little Methodist town in Garden City, Kansas, to a little Methodist woman who has a slow talk and a drawl and comes from a place very much like their town. There were not that much difference in size, about 4,000 or 5,000 difference in size. There were 22 churches. They even had more churches per capita than Monroeville did. And they were fascinated by her and they liked her. They did not like Truman Capote. They thought he was weird.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I read. So I wasn't sure about that. But
No, her 90 pages of notes became, and incidentally, she never wrote down a note while she was talking to people. She remembered, she recalled what they said,
wow.
but she only wrote in her notebook what they said when she got back to the hotel.
In 1961, she went on to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction for Mockingbird. And then in 62, the movie comes out, and there are some great photographs of Harper Lee and Gregory Peck together. So she obviously gave her permission for the movie, and she did some initial publicity. And when she became a literary icon, it seems that just when the world wanted to get to know her better, she kind of receded in the background a bit. Is that a fair analysis, that she became somehow uncomfortable with all of the attention and from that the book garnered?
Yes, I think that's a accurate reading. She was a notoriously private person. In fact, I think one reason why my wife and Nelle bonded so was because my wife was very much like Nelle. She also was a very private person. She had very close friendships, wonderful, intimate friendships, but she did not like casual friendships. And Nelle was very much the same way. When you made a friend with Nelle, it was a lifelong friend, and she would do anything for you. But she did not go out of the way to meet people or to create friendships. I'd say the term private and the term social are not contradictory. But on the other hand, there are boundaries to socialization if you are an intensely private person.
Was she reluctant to talk about To Kill a Mockingbird if people brought it up, or did she just shy away from the whole subject?
She shied away from the whole subject. If you ask a very specific question, which we almost never did, she would answer it. But I had assumed that one reason why she did not like being around literary people was her feeling that everyone was out to exploit in some way or another her or To Kill a Mockingbird or to find some new nugget that they could write an article about in the New Yorker or Atlantic Monthly. And so, and besides that, we liked her as a friend. We did not so much care about her as a writer. Not that we didn't like her writing, but it was the person that drew us to her. It was not the writer that drew us to her.
And I know that I'm guilty of wishing that she had continued writing books and publishing. What was the reason why she felt the need to stop? I mean, I'm sure she wrote, but never really published another novel until Go Set a Watchman, of course.
Her answer to that was, I never needed to.
She said everything she had to say, right?
Yes, she said, I said what I wanted to say, and I had no need to write another book. And when you think about how much the first book sold and how much the first book made, if you're an intensely private person and you have already had your privacy shattered by children, by the tens of thousands who write and ask if she will sign a book for them or write a note to their fourth grade class or their eighth grade class, you realize that fame has its downside. And to give you an example of this, after her stroke and after she moved to Meadows Assisted Living in Monroeville, the little museum, the wonderful little museum in the courthouse there, asked me if I would carry a box of letters to her assisted living. And I said, of course I would. And so I pick up this very large cardboard box of letters, and it's the letters from middle school students somewhere in, I can't even remember where it was from now, the class, but Northeast. And I took them in and I said, Nelle, the museum sent these letters over that came from a class. And she said, get those things out of here. I've been writing letters congratulating teachers and students for their stories about To Kill a Mockingbird my whole life, and I'm not going to do it in an assisted living. And so I trudged back across the street with the box. She could be very firm and fairly antisocial when she wanted to be. And after she had signed thousands and thousands of letters to teachers congratulating their students on the wonderful stories about characters they had written about in To Kill a Mockingbird, she was done with that. She was tired of that.
And her sister was quite protective of her, correct? She was very protective.
Yes, both sisters. Miss Alice, of course, who handled her finances and handled legal matters, was much more intimately connected to her business life. But Louise Connor was the middle sister, was equally concerned about her privacy and welfare. And when we became good friends of Louise, long before we became friends of either Alice or Nelle, we were amazed at how loving the three sisters were, how protective they were of each other. For a long time, Louise thought that we were just trying to get to know Nelle. And I told Nelle that the only time I'd been around, I told Louise the only time I had been around Nelle, I had found her impolite, discourteous, private to a fault, and that I did not like her very much. And so for about 15 years, we drove from Auburn to Eufaula, about 40 miles away, in order to take her to lunch on Sunday afternoons and to sit in the yard and watch the birds. And for many of those years, she didn't say a thing about Harper Lee, and we didn't ask her a thing about Harper Lee for fear that she would think we were coming because we were trying to learn something about Harper Lee, rather than the utterly delightful and loving Louise Connor. And we had much in common. She had gone to Auburn, where I taught. Her husband was a graduate of Auburn. And so we had lots in common ourselves. And at that point, I was not particularly interested in knowing about Harper Lee anyway.
What do you think her contribution to literature is? What do you think her legacy is?
You can start off with popularity. The New York Times book review section in December of last year, December 19th of 2021, it had a contest going for some time, celebrating their 125th anniversary of that section of the New York Times. So they asked readers of the book review section to pick their favorite book that had been published in the previous 125 years. And at the end of the contest on the 19th of December, almost a year ago, exactly from where we are now, the respondents, including people from 67 different countries, voted To Kill a Mockingbird the most beloved book of the century, of the last 125 years. So you can go anywhere in the world and you can strike up a conversation with any educated person just by mentioning Harper Lee and To Kill a Mockingbird. You can't do that with any other book I know. not Gone with the Wind, not Sophie's Choice. The whole pantheon of American literature is out there, but the single part of that pantheon that is most beloved worldwide is a story about children growing up in a fractured world, an imperfect world, the world of childhood challenged, and with the first elements of terror and injustice that they're having to deal with. And what can be a more important book for a 14 or 15-year-old just realizing how flawed the world is than to read that book and those characters?
And shortly before she passed away, she gave the okay for Go Set a Watchman to be released. What made her finally decide, after all those years, to release another book?
That's a really good question. And my wife and I stayed away from asking her questions that we felt were too personal to be any of our business. So we never asked that question. However, I did say, we were down right after the announcement, and I said, Nelle, what in the world made you allow people to publish your new book? And she said, what new book? And all of a sudden, given all the rumors of dementia and everything else, which were untrue, but that was the one moment I was really shaken, because I thought, oh my Lord, she doesn't even know her book's being published. And I said, your new book, Go Set a Watchman. And there was this Cheshire cat grin on her face, which slowly appeared. And she said, that's not my new book, that's my old book. And of course, it was the first book. And in terms of presentist historians and literary critics who have bashed To Kill a Mockingbird for being far too kind to her racist father, I would point out the first book she wrote when she was in her 20s was a diatribe, a vicious denunciation of her father that is filled with so much profanity by a young adult that my wife finally got tired of reading it and said, I'm going to sleep. I had to speak about it 24 hours after I got the first copy of it. And I was doing a press conference representing the family and Nelle. And so I had to read it. And Dorothy said, well, I want to read it first. And I said, well, I've got to read it. You want to do the press conference tomorrow morning? She said, I'm not doing any press conference. And I said, well, I'll read it out loud. And so I started reading it out loud. And after about 4 hours of reading, my voice almost gone, Dorothy said, I've had enough of profanity and denunciation of a father. I can't stand any more of this. I'm going to bed, turn the light off. So I had to read the rest of it on my lap in the hotel. But my point is, if you want a young adult who is eviscerating her father for racism, you got it in spades.
Yeah, that's right.
And so I can't quite understand why we continue to get literary critics and presentist historians who say, well, the flaw in To Kill a Mockingbird is she's too kind to her father. Well, why don't you read her first book? Would it be too much to ask you to satisfy all your lust for denunciation of a father who is imperfect and a man of his times by first reading her first novel?
Yeah, that would help.
That would help. That would help. And I just am astounded at my profession for their, I won't say stupidity, but I will say that once they get their head around an idea that To Kill a Mockingbird is really a timepiece lost in the apartheid of South Alabama in the early part of the 20th century. And once they can break out of that kind of time warp and realized who the woman was, and that the woman wrote other things than To Kill a Mockingbird. And the first thing she wrote was this evisceration of her father's racism. Maybe they'll be able to understand her in the context of her times and her career in a more satisfying way than they are now.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about concerns the privacy of an author, because when I was going to college, we were taught in our English courses that once a writer writes the book, it's done. The book goes out there and the author is basically dead from the book, and you just concentrate on the book. And being that Harper Lee was so private and didn't like all of the attention and the sensation of her book being published, and everybody wanting to talk to her, they wanted to get close to her, they wanted to know her. Why do you think, and another writer comes to mind, Louisa May Alcott, also after she published Little Women, she was another writer who had a disdain for the attention. She did not want people talking to her. She didn't do lectures. But why do you think readers are not only fascinated by the book itself, why do they want to know so much about the writer?
Tara, I think this is part of just human curiosity. People you admire, people you love, people you respect, whether all of that is actually tactile. That is, you're shaking their hand, you're talking to them, you're putting your arm around them, or whether it's distant, that is somebody who's a famous writer that you love, but you really don't know them and you've never met them. Whatever it is, there is a great desire to know more about people that you respect and love. And almost never do we fully understand that there are some people who want to be respected and loved, and there are other people who just want to be left alone. And since we can't figure that out altogether, we take chances, we take risks, we write them letters. We may even call them on the telephone and say, I so admire your work. And that they may think, really what I'm doing is I'm making a pizza right now, and I don't have time to talk to you. Or who are you? And so, as you know, as anyone who writes knows, writing may be the most solitary occupation in the history of the human race. The one thing you do not want is for other people to be interrupting the world of your imagination. You want to be left completely alone with yourself and your imagination. And when people interrupt that, especially at a critical moment when you have in your mind an entire plot for something or some part of this book, and you know exactly where you're going, and then all of a sudden the phone rings or somebody knocks on the door or a friend shows up, and then when that interruption is over, you don't remember where you were, you don't remember where you were going. And so it's no wonder that so many writers have a place that is as important as their house, where they can go and be absolutely alone, where there is no telephone, where there is no interruption, where nobody knows who they are. And I don't think it's an accident that Nelle winds up going from the most social, kind-hearted place you can imagine, Monroeville, Alabama, where everybody wants to know everything that's going on in your life because there's not much going on of cosmic importance in Monroeville, Alabama. And so people are always asking you about this person or that person, or how's your writing going, or how long are you going to be here before you go back to New York City? And she goes from that intensely social and private world into the most anonymous city in America when she went there. The one place where you could get completely lost and nobody cares whether you get completely lost. You can live in anonymity in New York City probably better than any other place in America.
That's right. You can. I'm
And
from New
so,
York. I'm from Brooklyn originally, but I know when I go back to New York, even though I'm nobody, no one knows who I am anyway, but they don't care. No one cares in New York. You could just, it's like you have a mask on when you're walking around.
well, Tara, if you ever want to change your life, go to Monroeville. Uh, you will walk down the street for the first time, and there will be two people who will be pointing at you and saying, "Who is that? And why is she here? And what is she doing? And what does she want?" And then all of a sudden, they will move from that stage to the, "Isn't she sweet? She's really kind. I've never met anybody from New York who's as nice as she is." And all of a sudden, you are sucked into that vortex.
Right.
And that's exactly what Nell wanted to leave, not to become part of again. And it was only that stroke that ever brought her home.
And that was in 2006.
That's right.
So how would you like people to remember your friend Harper Lee?
Uh, well, I guess the first thing I would say is what I would say about uh, my own life. That I would like for them to understand that there's a difference between being a private person and being a loner or an unhappy person or an antisocial person. You can be intensely social and just want to be intensely social with a handful of people. And I don't, Darty and I never had a better friend than Nelle Harper Lee. We never shared funnier stories or intimate details of our lives with anyone that we trusted more than Harper Lee. And the second thing I would say is the the freedom to be who you are in the presence of people who love you most. So that if you are a person who just tends to stop talking for a while, that doesn't mean the person doesn't like you. It just means the person is tired of you for a while. And maybe it's time for you to go home.
Right.
Or uh, maybe I have difficulty because I'm a very social person and I want people to be like me. And it was really hard for me to let Nell be like Nell. My wife was an extremely private person. She was comfortable with Nell from the first time we ever met. And I think that the ability to interject multiple people into any human relationship is partly a matter of how much you're willing to bend and change and become someone else in their presence in order not to intimidate them or frighten them or bore them more likely with what your narrative of life is. And Nell was absolutely wonderful about accepting us where we were, just as we were wonderful about accepting her where she was. And even when she was joking, even when she was jocular with me, and she would say something like, "You're much too intelligent to be a Baptist preacher," which was one of her favorite lines when I pontificated about something. And at a certain stage of friendship, at a certain stage of friendship, you realize that it doesn't matter that she's not poking fun at you. She loves you, and that she loves you enough, and there is enough intimacy between you that you can accept what she's saying because it's not the real Nell. Uh, Nell would have preferred I had not been a Baptist preacher, but at the same time, Nell loved me, and I loved her.
And also in your book, you called her one of the most remarkable women of the 20th century. And I know those of us who loved To Kill a Mockingbird, even though we didn't know her, we certainly feel the same way. So, Mr. Flynt, I want to thank you so much for being here today and talking to me about one of my favorite authors, Harper Lee. And I wish you so much success with the new book and your upcoming book tour.
Thank you, Tara. You've been a wonderful interviewer, and I appreciate that very much. I don't always have that happen.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks to my very special guest, Wayne Flynt, for being here and sitting down with me to talk about one of my favorite authors, Harper Lee. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of Tea with Tara. And until next time, keep writing.